If you had told me a few years ago that my backyard would become the battlefield for a psychological war over a piece of dirt, I probably would have laughed and gone back to fixing my lawnmower. But life has a funny way of shifting the ground beneath your feet when you least expect it. My name is Lucas Vance, and for over a decade, I lived a blissfully quiet life on a 2-acre lot just outside of Oak Haven, a town that was slowly being swallowed by upscale suburban developments, which was fine by me because my property sat at the very end of a dead-end road, tucked away behind a thick line of old-growth pine trees that my grandfather had planted when the land was nothing but wild brush. That specific corner of the property, right where the pines met a natural limestone slope, was my sanctuary, the place where I built a small wooden deck to drink my coffee on misty mornings, away from the noise of the world and away from the ever-increasing hustle of the new neighborhood creeping up around us. But everything changed on a scorching Saturday afternoon in mid-July when I drove back from a grueling 4-day business trip in Chicago, exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than a cold beer and the silence of my woods, only to find the serene silence replaced by the muffled, thumping bass of house music and the unmistakable, sharp smell of fresh chlorine cutting through the summer air. I remember stepping out of my truck, completely disoriented, thinking for a split second that I had somehow turned down the wrong driveway. But as I walked through my side gate, my boots sinking into what used to be a patch of wild clover, my brain just completely froze because right there, taking up a massive, freshly bulldozed chunk of my property, was a sprawling, multi-tiered infinity edge pool, its bright blue water shimmering under the sun like a luxury resort that had dropped out of the sky and landed squarely on my land. Standing by the edge of this concrete monster, holding a margarita and wearing an obnoxious linen shirt, was Julian Vance, no relation. Thankfully, just a guy who had bought the adjacent lot a year prior and had immediately made it his life's mission to turn his property into a flashy architectural statement that could be seen from space. Julian was the definition of a man driven by deep-seated insecurity masked as wealthy confidence, always remodeling, always hiring crews to build bigger decks, taller fences, and more elaborate outdoor kitchens, as if he was desperately trying to win a neighborhood competition that nobody else was participating in. But this time, he hadn't just pushed the envelope, he had completely torn it to pieces. As I stood there, staring at the destruction of my grandfather's pine grove, Julian caught sight of me, his face lighting up with that plastic, overly familiar smile that wealthy people use when they're about to hand you a problem and expect you to thank them for it. Julian strolled over toward the property line, or rather, where the property line used to be, casually swirling the ice in his glass and looking at me as if he were a gracious host welcoming a weary traveler into his private kingdom. "Incredible, isn't it, Lucas?" he said, his voice dripping with that smooth, unbothered arrogance that immediately made my blood run cold. But I just stood there, my hands balled into fists inside my pockets, looking at the raw, exposed clay where my grandfather's trees had been ripped out by the roots. "Why is your pool on my land, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice flat, deliberately stripping away any emotion because I could already feel the dangerous edge of a panic attack threatening to cloud my judgment. But instead of showing a shred of guilt, he actually let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, come on. Let's not get bogged down in petty semantics," he said, waving his hand toward the shimmering water. "It's a shared aesthetic improvement, really, because let's be honest, you were just letting this back corner go to seed anyway. So I figured I'd do us both a favor and maximize the view." Hearing him call the destruction of my family's heritage a shared improvement felt like a physical blow to the chest, a modern twist on a feudal land grab disguised as suburban gentrification. And when I walked over to the edge of the new concrete deck, my heart sank even further as I located the original iron survey pin, now buried under 2 inches of his imported flagstone. "You need to understand something right now," I said, looking him dead in the eye, my voice shaking just enough for him to notice. "This isn't a mistake. Julian, you knew exactly where the line was, and you built it anyway." His smile didn't vanish, but it hardened, turning into that cold, defensive mask of a man who believed his bank account gave him the right to rewrite reality. "The contractors handled the site layout. Lucas, if you have a problem, take it up with them, but the concrete is poured, the permits are signed, and honestly, Nobody is going to tear down a $200,000 project over a few feet of wild brush. So maybe just take a dip, relax, and realize this actually bumps up your own property value. I didn't answer him. I just turned around and walked back to my empty house, the thumping bass of his party ringing in my ears for the next 12 hours while I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by old deeds, county plat maps, and the certified survey from when I inherited the place. Every single document confirmed what I already knew. There was no gray area, no historical easement, just a blatant, calculated invasion by a neighbor who assumed I was too poor or too tired to fight him. But the real nightmare began Monday morning when I started calling the township. I spent 4 agonizing days trapped in a bureaucratic labyrinth, being shuffled from building inspectors to code enforcement, then to the zoning board. Each department passing me off like a hot potato because nobody wanted to deal with a wealthy homeowner who had technically obtained a building permit based on a fraudulent, unverified site plan. One clerk even told me, with complete sincerity, that since the structure was already finished, it was now a civil matter, meaning the city wouldn't intervene unless a judge ordered them to, leaving me completely isolated while Julian continued to host extravagant, loud backyard gatherings every single evening, his guests laughing, drinking, and taking selfies on land that my family had paid taxes on for 3 generations. The sheer psychological weight of watching strangers sunbathe on my property, looking down at my modest house with a mix of pity and amusement, started twisting my anger into an obsession, a dark, consuming curiosity that kept me awake at night, staring out the window at the glowing neon lights of his infinity pool. But then, during a heavy downpour on the 2nd week of August, everything clicked, because as I stood on my old wooden porch watching the torrential rain, I noticed how the water was behaving now that Julian had altered the landscape. To build his massive pool deck, he had altered the natural grade of the limestone slope, pushing all the natural runoff toward a narrow, forgotten ribbon of untouched clay right at the very back of my property, a tiny strip that his bulldozers hadn't been able to reach because of the steep terrain. The water wasn't just draining there, it was pooling heavily, trapping the moisture against the decorative stone retaining wall he had built to support the deep end of his pool. And because I knew the geology of Oakhaven like the back of my hand, I realized something Julian's expensive city engineers had completely overlooked. That limestone slope was porous, and by redirecting the entire watershed into that single, confined clay trench on my land, he had unwittingly created a massive, natural pressure cooker right beneath his own foundation. But more importantly, that tiny strip of mud belonged entirely to me, and I was under no legal obligation to help him drain it. The moment that realization washed over me, the anger completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating calm, and I stopped calling the city, stopped glaring over the fence, and stopped acknowledging Julian's existence entirely, because I knew that in the game of property warfare, the most dangerous thing you can give an arrogant man is the illusion that he has already won. The very next afternoon, while Julian was at his corporate office, I went out to that muddy, waterlogged trench with a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a wild idea born out of pure geological spite. I didn't hire a crew, I didn't use loud machinery, I just worked by hand in the fading summer light, deepening the trench, shaping the banks, and introducing a carefully selected variety of native wetland reeds, cattails, and specific aquatic plants that thrive in heavy, stagnant moisture. I was intentionally creating a hyper-dense, permanent marshland right against his pristine stone retaining wall, and to make it completely bulletproof against any future legal complaints, I registered the plot with a local state university conservation initiative, officially designating that tiny, forgotten ribbon of clay as a private wildlife restoration habitat. Within 3 weeks, the standing water became a permanent, thriving ecosystem. And then, right on cue, the first wild ducks arrived, finding a perfect, sheltered sanctuary with a constant supply of fresh, filtered runoff water. What Julian envisioned as an exclusive, high-end oasis for Oakhaven's elite quickly devolved into an unpredictable, chaotic nature documentary, because ducks do not care about luxury branding, nor do they respect the illusion of suburban status. They swam in my marsh, but they preferred to sunbathe on his immaculate, heated flagstone deck, leaving messy trail reminders of their presence everywhere. And whenever his wealthy friends gathered for cocktails, A dozen noisy mallards would aggressively waddle through the lounge chairs like feathered property inspectors. Julian tried everything, installing high-frequency ultrasonic deterrents that the birds completely ignored, and hiring a private wildlife specialist who took one look at my official state conservation signs and told Julian there was absolutely nothing he could do because harassing nesting birds in a registered habitat carried massive federal fines. The absolute breaking point came in late September when Julian, completely consumed by rage and frustrated by the deterioration of his backyard aesthetic, filed an emergency health and safety complaint with the county, claiming my marsh was an unauthorized nuisance that was threatening the structural integrity of the neighborhood. But his arrogance blindfolded him, because by demanding an official county investigation, he forced a team of senior state engineers and high-level land surveyors to physically come out to the property with advanced GPS equipment. And unlike the low-level township clerks, these people were looking at the raw, unedited truth. For 2 days, they measured the limestone slope, traced the water flow, and compared the physical layout of the pool against the ancient master deeds of the county, and by Friday afternoon, the entire narrative collapsed on top of him. The official report didn't just conclude that my marsh was perfectly legal. It revealed that Julian's contractors had severely falsified the boundary lines, showing that over a third of the massive concrete infinity pool, including the heavy, deep-in structural supports, was sitting illegally on my land, while violating major environmental setbacks regarding the natural watershed. The county issued an immediate, non-negotiable corrective mandate, forcing Julian to bring in heavy demolition crews to cut through his beautiful, expensive concrete, tear down the infinity edge, and reconstruct a significantly smaller, heavily modified pool entirely within his own boundary line, a devastatingly expensive process that turned his crown jewel into a permanent, clunky reminder of his own hubris. Today, my grandfather's old pine grove is gone, but the natural marsh has matured into something deeply peaceful, a quiet, thriving space where I sit every morning with my coffee, watching the ducks glide across the water while the faint sound of demolition equipment finally fades into history. It taught me that when someone tries to build over your boundaries, you don't need to scream, you don't need to lose your mind, you just need to stay patient, document everything, and let the unyielding weight of reality do the heavy lifting for you. But it makes you wonder about the fragile nature of communities and the silent wars fought behind manicured suburban lawns. So I'm curious what you would have done if you walked into your backyard and found a luxury project built on your property. Would you have gone straight to a lawyer on day one, demanded an immediate, stressful shouting match across the fence, or would you have played the long game and let nature handle the boundary dispute for you? Let me know in the comments below, because these neighborhood standoffs always bring out strong opinions, and I want to know who you think was truly in the right here.